Thank you. I'm going to try something little crazy on you today. I'm going to try. People know me; will be used to that. But I'm gonna try a proposal on you for how do we get there. It's ambitious. But I've discovered lately, it's strange. I've discovered that when you put forward research proposals to research committees, if you put ambitious ideas, you'll be looked at like a maniac. But if you're talking to Google, they want to hear, how are you going to change the world? And I'm about to give you a presentation I gave to the CEO of Google Israel. And the idea was, how do we change money? To my great surprise, the answer at the end of the presentation was, let's do it. So we'll see whether you have the same response, or whether you think this truly is insane. I have to say though, my friend and sometime mentor Peter Brown is in some ways a foil for this presentation, because when we did with Jeff the book project on the economics of the Anthropocene, there was a part that I wrote on currency, which Peter said, "Nah, this ain't ready. This ain't ripe. This is a little bit off the wall." So this is the revenge of that of that part. We'll see where we go. I'll just give a little bit of background, which is that I'm currently involved in a research project at McGill, which is trying to track the footprint of people's behavior. Inspired a lot by Jeff's work, actually, on planetary boundaries and ways to measure our footprint in relation to planetary boundaries. And the question is, what would happen if all of us carried an account ourselves for how we were impacting on planetary boundaries? And take that idea and put it into the context of a gift economy, and you have the essence of this proposal. Let's just review for a second what money is now. I call it transactional currency. We could call it currency for exchange value. Currency flows from a buyer's account to a seller's account. And it's representing a perception in price as to what the exchange value of whatever good or service involved is. And if you think about this for a moment, you will realize just how abstract and ephemeral the notion of money is. When I've given this presentation, people have told me it's too complicated. The concept of money you're trying to get across has too many steps to it. Give it to me in a slogan. And I say to them, explain money then. Just please explain to me the existing operation of money. I can show you, Georg Simmel's 1,000-page treatise on the philosophy of money, but just the notion that we used to carry coins that had some notion of value, and we translated that into promissory notes. Pay the bearer on demand. It still says that on the US dollar. Go somewhere and try to get what that value is on demand, that payer on demand element in the US dollar, and there's nothing that you can be given except another dollar, right? So there's already something very intriguing and dematerialized in this representation of value that comes in currency, but we're used to it. We're used to that mode of flow, but it is flowing, again, notionally from a buyer's account to a seller's account to meet a price. Has a huge limitation, which is that it can't measure and account for social impacts and contributions. Economists call this the problem of externality. Typically, what we try to say is, in a contemporary economy, we say, well, let's put a value on that externality and bring it back into the price system. Let's put a price on carbon, for example. Let's put a price on ecosystem services. If we could just put that back into the economy, then we could trade around it and use currency to produce the outcome. I say no. And that in principle, that actually isn't possible. Why? There's nothing to trade against the biosphere. There is a point at which the collective good and the impact upon the collective good actually cannot be represented in money. So if we can't accurately measure and account for what I'm calling social impacts and contributions, we can try to adjust. We seek to correct for that broad market failure through tax, right? Because what we say is that we can take some of the reserve of currency attributed to transactions and then divert from that reserve towards the funding of a public good. Economists have long written about the problem of social cost. A Nobel Prize winning essay, The Problem of Social Cost of Ronald Coase. But that problem actually, we know, isn't adequately solved by the tax system, less and less adequately solved by the tax system, because we will underinvest in those goods that are held collectively if we're seeking a return upon them. Garrett Hardin took that to a famous extreme in The Tragedy of the Commons. So I think we could say there's a crisis of money, that it's very good at producing an economy of increasing value. Peter would call, this, I guess he would talk about an orphan discipline, yes. And he would say that, here we've got economics as an orphan discipline, but this is my recharacterization of the orphan discipline, that it can produce an economy of increasing exchange value, but it generates runaway social impacts. And those runaway social impacts are the Anthropocene. We've all seen this. I mean, we know now where we stand with respect to the ability of the economy to manage the social impacts that it generates, and the answer is it can't. So what would we do to produce what I'm going to call a social impact currency? Could we counterbalance currency that flows through promises to pay against something that would flow through promises to contribute? If you want to visualize this, if you want to visualize a kind of how Jeff asked us to think about stocks and flows, so how do you think about the flow of currency? I visualize it as a downstream movement from buyer to seller to buyer to seller to buyer to seller. The currency is always flowing towards some additional exchange value. You could imagine a social impact currency flowing upstream in the opposite direction, from contribution to contribution to contribution. That's a pay it forward idea. We tested it once at the law faculty, and some law faculties have tried something like this. Imagine that instead of paying tuition, you receive a gift. That is, that each successive generation is paid for by the contribution of the previous generation, and so on. So when you take on your role in the faculty, you're saying, oh, I'm receiving this good. It is a public good, actually. And in return for having received it, I will give to the next generation, and so on. So something like that exists in some measure when we're asking people, give, give, give. I know that my neighbor had to do that. Law deans do that a lot. But we know that there exists a different way of circulating value through gift exchange. Anthropologists have talked about it for a long time. So if gift economies can exist, why don't they just appear spontaneously? What is the difficulty associated with flowing currency according to gift? The answer is scale. It's difficult to scale. We know that kind of a flow relies upon tight social bonds. We tried to produce it in law school classes. We try to say, you're part of this. We all know each other. We keep in touch. We keep track of what the class of '68 did in comparison with the class of '69 did. We tell everybody we can have a kind of circulation, imperfect circulation of gift when we have relatively tight social bonds. In a global economy, that seems beyond reach. But let's just recall thinking about contributions of Indigenous communities, that they have functioned on this basis. What's circulated as currency, wampum, what's circulated as currency in the Kona circle, you know, the bracelets and necklaces and so on. Those were representations of contribution that circulated through society, which, by the way, you know, Christian missionaries had an awful lot of time understanding. They thought it was immoral that this potlatch ceremony would take place and so on. This was wasteful. But in fact, this was a representation of how the economy functioned in the transfer of gift from clan to clan and within the clan. I was born in 1959. By that year, the Inuit had never seen money in northern Canada. And they can still talk about the appearance of the money economy. So it's not that there was no economy. There was an economy. It functioned, but it was based on this other form of exchange. So what would be the technological prerequisites for scaling a gift economy? I've tried to set them out as follows. You can criticize me, you can tell me I've got them right or got them wrong, but I think something like this is what we would need. We would actually need to be able to measure and record. By the way, I'm cribbing in some measure from Elinor Ostrom, because Elinor Ostrom did, you know, that Nobel Prize winning work on how do commons get maintained, what allows communities to reproduce investments in common property. So I've tried to break this down into a number of elements, which I hope you'll see, I think, are now available to us. The first is to be able to measure and record all impacts and contributions in real time. If fishers are watching each other and seeing how much everybody's taking, how much they're giving back, and so on, that allows the community to produce this sort of relationship. But it's very hard to do that in a dispersed modern society. We need to be able to produce some form of feedback between the behavior and the built environment. What is the responsiveness taking place? Indigenous peoples thought they could read the signs in the forest and so on. They were able to see what the response back to them was if they took, and what they needed to restore if they had done so. But it's very difficult to produce that in a contemporary economy. We need, I think, also to, I use the term, you know, from another Nobel Prize winner of this past, about a week ago, Thaler, on nudging. But nudging is a contemporary way of speaking of, you know, social relations and social forces. So what is it that allows people to urge each other, shift each other, reframe the context in which they're making choices? How do we produce collectively that reframing of choices that can nudge behavior towards a diminished collective footprint? I think in a contemporary society, this one you may not agree with, but I think that in fact we do need, we can't sort of go to the concept of everyone living in Longhouse. I think that we are in a context where privacy, you know, needs to be maintained, and you will not get sharing of the kinds of information that I described above if you cannot guarantee privacy. But somehow you need to be able to protect privacy at the same time as tracing information to everyone. So how do you do those two? There seems to be a conflict there. And finally, there needs to be some kind of collective steering mechanism. I mean, it's one thing to have elders and you know, people who are capable of signaling to everyone how to orient themselves, but how do you produce that kind of collective steering mechanism in order to ensure the flow of a gift currency? Well, I think that some of these things are within reach now. I mean, first of all, I do think we have the methodologies for producing pretty good life cycle analysis. If you go to the website now, if you go Invent and other such you know, sources of data, you can start to ask questions about what's the impact of this cup and tie it to me. And secondly, you know, in the Internet of Things, where in principle, everyone could be connected to every act they have taken and pulled back into the life cycle of it, that the life cycle could be traced right into each interaction. That then starts to resemble and perhaps even enhance the sorts of capacities that tight communities had to survey and relate to the impacts that everybody had. We're getting more and more sophisticated on the nudging front, and we can start to deploy those behavioral signals on a wider scale. Behavioral economics is now advancing quite well. We have the tools of gamification, augmented reality, and so on that are placing people in settings where, for example, there was a presentation not long ago where groups seeking donations were saying, well, if I can put somebody right into the heart of the refugee camp and make them see how that feels, the way they're going to connect to the situation is going to be very different than if I'm just soliciting, their participation. So those kinds of experiences are now possible for us. The blockchain, has everybody heard of the blockchain? No. Oh, some yet. Well, I mean, right. I mean, so the infrastructure underlying Bitcoin, which is a way of storing dispersed data to which each individual has the lock and key, but nobody has control over the entire database. The ledger set up to make Bitcoin possible was put onto the blockchain, but the blockchain is now being generalized through something called Ethereum to a whole host of other applications. So imagine that we were carrying on the blockchain the record of all of our interactions, and that we could produce together basically the global footprint, what the global footprint looks like. And you add to that, I know some people find it frightening, but I think it's something we have to explore and be willing to explore. As far as a steering mechanism is concerned, the emerging capacities of artificial intelligence, and notably the artificial intelligence capacities associated with what's called the distributed autonomous organization, which means that actually the problem becomes governing the ways in which we are governed by forms of intelligence that we have produced. We'll go into that in more detail. But we are there now. I mean, this is happening now, and we know that huge resources are going into it by the Facebooks and Googles and so on. But if you put all of those elements together, you actually have, I think, the infrastructure of something that could give rise to, and I'll end on this, a methodology for social impact currency. So these are the pieces. If you could produce certified life cycle analysis, if you could automatically collect data on user impacts, if you could have baselines and profiles for everyone as to how they're doing with respect to their own account, their own impact account, a record of user footprint, nudges targeted to individuals, the aggregation of all data so we could understand, where are the interaction points, where does Jeff's use of his computer actually interact with people maybe not taking the plane today, and because they didn't take the plane today, we've reduced the impact. We've got people sitting on a conference call. How do we start to analyze all of those sets of interactions so that we're producing the nudges that then diminish the overall footprint? So let me just take you through the methodology. Imagine that you had a profile of all of us, and we know that there's some inventory of, let's say, transportation reduction. Some of us are taking the car, took the car today. We could be nudged not to do it. So we then have an inventory of nudgeable behaviors, and we put out a call for tender on that, on changing the behavioral pattern, respecting social impact. So let's say, here's my example, 40% of users drive cars despite available alternatives. We have a call for tender of nudge providers. In this case, it could be the STM, the Société de Transport de Montréal, which could take people by public transit, could be Bixi, could be any alternative means And to make it simple to begin with, we'll just say they would issue a coupon available targeted to those with the profile we want to change, and get them then to use the coupon on the alternative service. If that were achieved, and it would be documented on the blockchain that it was achieved because the transaction is recordable, the coupon would then become a redeemed and measured and recorded impact token. So it would now carry with it the evidence of what it had produced by way of a change. We're imagining that these impact-bearing coupons, which have become tokens, are then brought to a token exchange. And in this token exchange, anyone else who can produce a further impact reduction in the life cycle can then get the token. So for example, let's say that an electric bus manufacturer sees upstream from the STM that it's possible to take that impact reduction that the STM has achieved and enhance it with an electric bus. So the STM could pass its token to the bus manufacturer, say in exchange for a discount. And that manufacturer then might also look to see what else can be achieved by way of a further reduction, pass the token along. And it would work, therefore, as a method of circular exchange within the life cycle inventory. I'm sure that gives rise to a lot of questions. But let me stop there.
So in the tradition, we take about 5 minutes now for questions, reserving further conversations.
I'm kind of either puzzled or troubled by the pronouns in your general presentation, which are...
My mastery of language is limited.
Well, no, I'm not sure that's the point. And these are we, you, and I didn't hear they very often, but if you could do this,
right?
Who are those?
Well, that is a fantastic question. I mean, notice that this is not let's persuade the state to do something, or let's get a global constitution adopted by the following people, or let's have some authority bent to the will. This is implementation of who comes to play, so to speak. Now, what's interesting is that people thought, say, who's going to come to play on Bitcoin? Turns out people do. Will people come to play on a platform that is seeking to keep track of impacts on public goods? Can we bring them to it?
Who controls those bodies of data?
Google.
Well, that's interesting. So we've set this up as a not-for-profit. We've set this up as a not-for-profit, and the objective is to have the users of the platform govern the platform. That's the objective. But as soon as you talk to Google, does that get maintained? It's an interesting problem. I mean, one of the things is how do you can imagine the resources needed to put something like this into place. If you're pulling those resources together, what stake will the people providing resources want in the ultimate platform? We're saying the stake is you have tokens that enable the outcome, and that has value, and keep those tokens. So we're doing this by something called an initial coin offering. That's the methodology for implementing this. But maintaining and preserving the integrity of governance is a huge issue.
I'm really very, very happy to hear in your presentation, because you showed me right the end of the tunnel. I explained, because Last year, I presented to UN Citral paper related to the tracking of the global food chain. And one of the challenges we had, the authors, one of them was specialized on WTO. We had the challenge to identify ways how to impose or convince the agents on our global value chain to make this trackage of environmental footprint, especially water and carbon, for example. And would it impact the WTO regulation? At the end of the day, we made a very humble presentation in order not to raise this question. So my question to you, and we haven't thought of a picture like you gave us, it's fantastic. But my question to you is, do you have thought about the WTO regulation in your platform, and what if? What do you think?
Well, my sadly overly flip answer to that is that if only we were really facing a WTO problem, I would be thrilled, right? I would be so excited if we had the problem of thinking of this as producing impacts on trade. But I think that one of the things, I mean, to be a little less flip, we think we can ask the following question: what is the role of the WTO in regulating currency today? I think answer is zero. So if what we're talking about, and we can discuss why that is, but I think that if what we're talking about is a flow of currency, we're not talking about trade patterns. We're talking about currency. So I think we're WTO proof.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the nudging. So is it always a positive pull, or is it sometimes like a fear of punishment? And is it so in the example, if I understood it, if the primary focus was a monetary benefit, does it also try to I don't know, bring in something that you might also call more altruistic, like I want to be a good person kind of thing? Because if it's in the world of behavioral economics, I can just think of the nudging thing being quite an interesting thing. So I just wonder if you could expand on that.
Well, I don't know if my answer is going to be frustrating for you. I'm quite now, Catholic with a small c about how nudging will be deployed. And I'm even prepared to say, this is the most scandalous thing I'll say, that I think it's a question for artificial intelligence. In other words, I don't know what works. I think we can do experiments to figure out what works. We have some psychological experiments about, the contextualizations of things. One of the inspirations for us has been the former mayor of Bogota, Mocas, who did something weird that people thought would never work. He distributed signs with thumbs down and thumbs up to the citizens of Bogota, and he thought, I'm going to show you that we'll change patterns of civility and behavior in the streets. People thought he was nuts, and it worked. And so, I think it's an empirical question. The deeper, harder question is: are there things off limits? In other words, Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler talk about paternalistic libertarianism. I think is there libertarian thank you, libertarian paternalism, and the paternalism is never a very happy notion to introduce into this. Under what circumstances do we manipulate? Do we produce forms of shaming? Do we where are the limits upon the types of of behavioral nudge that we're prepared to accept. And to me, that becomes then a governance problem. And so I've talked with AI people, and they say, in principle, it's possible. In principle, it's possible to map out what are the predicted behaviors that are being discovered, and then to submit them to a user community.
That would be culturally specific too.
Could well be culturally specific.
A transferable
Yes.
beyond kind of higher industrial society technology.
It might, in fact, have to become extremely culturally specific and granular. But once again, that makes it into an AI issue.
Stephanie?
Yes, and I thought it was very interesting, but I'm maybe willing to play the bad cop and ask, what about privacy and ethical issues related to having a database on every act everyone does every day, and the power that is involved for the platform that has all this information?
So that's why I mean, maybe putting too much emphasis, too much faith in the blockchain notion. The blockchain notion is that nobody has the data, everybody has the data. And that, in fact, the only person who can trace, in principle, the only person who can trace any particular use is me. So I used to believe that there was a deep contradiction between trying to protect privacy and trying to share information. I'm now of the view that the only way to get people to share information is to ensure their privacy is ironclad. And that seems to be at least the technological prospect of encryption on the blockchain. Now, will we discover that what is impossible for supercomputers to crack now becomes possible to crack when we move into quantum computing and so on? Maybe.